Manhattan, New York. Rao's Restaurant on East 114th Street in East Harlem. Thursday evening, November 13th, 1969. The most exclusive Italian restaurant in New York City, where reservations were impossible unless you had connections, where the dining room held only 10 tables, and where each table was essentially owned by someone important. Mob bosses, politicians, celebrities, people whose power was measured not by how much money they had, but by whether they could get a table at Rao's when they wanted one, where being present meant something about your status in New York's power structure, where the food was excellent, but the real currency was access and recognition, and the ability to sit among people who controlled significant portions of the city's legitimate and illegitimate economy. At table 4, the best table in the restaurant, positioned where everyone entering had to see who was sitting there, sat Carmine Galante, 59 years old, a capo in the Bonanno crime family, someone who'd spent decades building power through violence and strategic alliances, someone who controlled significant heroin distribution operations throughout New York, someone who was positioning himself to take over the entire Bonanno family and possibly to become one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, someone whose ambition was matched only by his reputation for brutality and his absolute refusal to show respect to anyone he viewed as inferior. Galante was dining with 3 associates, discussing business matters that required the privacy that Rao's provided, conducting conversations about heroin distribution and territorial disputes, and payments that were overdue, the kind of business that made Galante wealthy and powerful, and that required the kind of connections and organizational capability that only established mob families possessed, that couldn't be built overnight or through individual ambition alone, but required generations of accumulated power and political connections and relationships with legitimate businesses that could launder money and provide cover for criminal operations. At 8:47 p.m., Frank Lucas entered Rao's Restaurant, 39 years old, at the peak of his power as the most successful independent heroin distributor in New York, someone who'd built an empire by importing pure product directly from Southeast Asia and selling it wholesale at prices that undercut the Italian mob's traditional distribution networks. Someone who'd made himself extraordinarily wealthy through methods that bypassed the mob's control over heroin importation. Someone whose very existence threatened the Italian family's monopoly over drug distribution, and who represented everything that traditional organized crime viewed with suspicion and hostility. An outsider, specifically a black criminal, who'd achieved success without asking permission, without paying tribute, without acknowledging that the Italian mob controlled who could and couldn't operate in New York's drug trade. Lucas had come to Rao's deliberately, intentionally, as a statement. He'd obtained a reservation through connections he'd built with legitimate businessmen who had access to tables, had dressed in an expensive suit that announced wealth without being ostentatious, had arrived alone because bringing associates would suggest he needed protection or backup when Lucas wanted to demonstrate that he was confident enough to walk into an Italian mob stronghold without fear, that his power was sufficient, that he didn't need to worry about being attacked in a restaurant full of witnesses. Lucas knew that Carmine Galante would be at Rao's on Thursday evening. Everyone who followed mob activities knew that Galante dined at Rao's every Thursday at table 4, that this was his routine, his statement about his status and his power. Lucas had chosen to come to Rouse specifically because Galante would be there, because Lucas wanted to make it clear that he wasn't intimidated by the Italian mob, that he belonged in spaces they considered their exclusive territory, that being black and being independent didn't mean he had to hide or to limit himself to Harlem or to accept that certain restaurants and certain establishments were off limits to criminals who hadn't been born into Italian families. Lucas was shown to a table by the owner, who recognized him and who understood that Lucas's presence would create tension, but who also understood that refusing to seat a legitimate customer with a reservation would be bad business and would potentially create problems with the people who'd facilitated Lucas's access. Lucas sat at his table, table 7, positioned where he could see Galante and where Galante could see him, making no attempt to hide his presence or to pretend he hadn't noticed that the most powerful Italian mobster in the restaurant was sitting 15 feet away. The atmosphere in Rouse changed immediately. Conversations at other tables stopped or lowered to whispers. People glanced between Lucas and Galante, understanding that these two men represented competing power structures in New York's drug trade, that Lucas's presence in Galante's territory was either extraordinarily brave or extraordinarily stupid, that something significant was about to happen because men like Galante didn't tolerate challenges to their authority without response. Galante noticed Lucas immediately, recognized him despite having never met him personally, understood that Lucas's presence at Rouse was deliberate provocation designed to demonstrate that Lucas didn't respect the boundaries that traditionally separated Italian mob operations from independent black criminal enterprises. Galante's face flushed red with anger, with indignation that this outsider, this black drug dealer, who'd built his operation without Italian permission, would dare to enter Rouse on a Thursday evening when Galante was dining, would dare to sit at a table as if he belonged there, as if he was equal to the Italian mobsters who'd controlled New York's organized crime for generations. Galante stood up from his table, his movement sudden enough that his associates immediately tensed, understanding that their boss was about to do something, that the evening was about to become complicated in ways that might require violence, or at least aggressive confrontation. Galante walked across the restaurant toward Lucas's table, his body language aggressive and confrontational, making it clear that this wasn't going to be a friendly greeting or a respectful acknowledgement of a fellow criminal, but was instead going to be a public assertion of dominance, a statement about hierarchy and power, and who really controlled New York's drug trade. Galante reached Lucas's table and didn't wait for invitation or acknowledgement. He simply began speaking, his voice loud enough that everyone in the restaurant could hear, loud enough that this was clearly intended as public theater designed to humiliate Lucas in front of witnesses, to establish that despite Lucas's wealth and success, he remained subordinate to the Italian mob, remained an outsider who existed only with their tolerance. "Frank Lucas," Galante said, his voice carrying contempt that was almost palpable, his tone making it clear he was addressing someone he viewed as fundamentally inferior. "Look at this. The famous Frank Lucas, the black drug dealer who thinks he's a real gangster, sitting in Rouse like he belongs here, like this is his restaurant, like he's somebody important enough to dine, where real organized crime does business. You've got some nerve coming here. You've got some fucking nerve. Thinking you can just walk into our places, sit at our tables, act like you're our equal. The restaurant went completely silent. Even the kitchen staff stopped making noise. Everyone present understood that Carmine Galante was publicly humiliating Frank Lucas, was asserting mob dominance in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed, was creating a situation that would require response because not responding would mean accepting degradation that no one with power could tolerate without losing that power. Lucas didn't stand up, didn't react visibly to the insult. He simply looked up at Galante with eyes that showed no emotion, no fear, no anger, just cold calculation about whether this moment required immediate violence or whether it would be better handled through methods that were more strategic and more devastating than anything that could be accomplished by attacking Galante in a crowded restaurant full of mob associates who would immediately retaliate. Galante, interpreting Lucas's silence as weakness or fear, continued his public humiliation. You know what you are, Lucas. You're a fucking N-word who got lucky. You found a way to import heroin that bypassed our suppliers. Good for you. Very clever. But you're still just a N-word playing at being a gangster. You're still someone who operates only because we haven't decided yet whether killing you would be worth the trouble. You don't belong at Rouse. You don't belong in our world. You belong in Harlem, running your little operation until we decide to take it over or shut it down. Galante leaned down closer to Lucas, his voice dropping but still audible to nearby tables. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to finish your meal quickly and quietly. You're going to leave Rouse and never come back unless I personally invite you, which will never happen. And starting next week, you're going to pay tribute to the Bonanno family, 20% of your gross revenue from heroin sales. That's the price for operating in our city without permission. That's what you owe for thinking you could build an independent operation without acknowledging that the Italian mob controls who can and can't distribute drugs in New York. The silence in Rouse was absolute. Everyone was watching Lucas, waiting to see how he would respond to this public humiliation, to these demands that he pay tribute and stay out of Italian establishments, to this use of racial slurs and explicit statements that Lucas was inferior because of his race and his lack of connection to Italian organized crime. Lucas took a sip of his wine, set the glass down carefully, and looked at Galante with an expression that made several witnesses later describe feeling frightened despite being outside the conflict, despite not being targets of whatever Lucas was planning. "Mr. Galante," Lucas said, his voice quiet and controlled, showing no emotion except perhaps a cold amusement that suggested he found this entire confrontation more interesting than threatening. "You just made several mistakes. First, you used that word to describe me in front of all these witnesses. Second, you demanded that I pay tribute to your family, despite the fact that I've built my operation independently without using your suppliers or your distribution networks. Third, you threaten to shut down my business as if you have the capability to do that without consequences. And fourth, you did all of this publicly in front of dozens of people, which means there's no way for either of us to back down without looking weak." Lucas continued, his voice still quiet, but now carrying something that made Galante's associates move their hands toward weapons, made other patrons in the restaurant understand that they were witnessing something dangerous. I'm going to finish my meal. I'm going to leave Rouse when I'm ready, not when you tell me to leave. And I'm not going to pay $1 in tribute to the Bonanno family or to any other Italian family. I built my operation independently. I import my product from sources you don't control. I distribute through networks you can't access. And I'm going to continue doing exactly what I've been doing, regardless of whether you approve or not. Lucas stood up, still moving slowly and deliberately, positioning himself so that he and Galante were face to face, so that everyone in the restaurant could see that Lucas wasn't backing down, wasn't showing fear, wasn't accepting Galante's assertion of dominance. But here's what I am going to do, Mr. Galante. I'm going to remember this conversation. I'm going to remember that you called me that word in front of all these people. I'm going to remember that you demanded tribute and threatened my operation. And I'm going to respond to your disrespect in ways that will make you regret every word you just said. You want to know what happens when Italian mobsters forget that black criminals can be just as ruthless and just as powerful as any traditional organized crime family. You're about to find out. Lucas walked past Galante toward the exit, leaving money on his table to cover his bill, moving through the silent restaurant where everyone watched him leave, where everyone understood that this confrontation wasn't over, but was instead just beginning, that Galante's public humiliation of Lucas would require a response that would reshape power dynamics between the Italian mob and independent black criminals in ways that would affect New York's drug trade for years. The next morning, Friday, November 14th, 1969, Carmine Galante received a message at his social club in Little Italy. The message was delivered by a young man who walked into the club, handed an envelope to Galante's bodyguard, and left before anyone could question him. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper with typed text. You demanded tribute. You threatened my operation. You used language that can't be forgiven. You have 7 days to close every heroin operation the Bonanno family controls in Harlem. After 7 days, your people start dying. Not arrested, not beaten, dead. You disrespected Frank Lucas in public. Now you pay the price. Galante showed the message to his associates, laughed at it, called it empty threat from a criminal who didn't understand how real organized crime worked, who didn't comprehend that the Italian mob had survived for generations by destroying anyone who challenged their authority, who didn't realize that making threats against a capo in a major crime family would trigger massive retaliation that Lucas couldn't possibly survive. But Galante also took precautions. He increased security for his key heroin distributors in Harlem. He ordered his people to be vigilant, to watch for any signs that Lucas was planning attacks, to be ready to respond with immediate violence if Lucas's organization made any moves against Bonanno operations. Galante believed he'd prepared adequately, believed that his organization's size and resources and connections would be sufficient to protect his people and to retaliate overwhelmingly if Lucas was stupid enough to follow through on his threats. Monday morning, November 17th, 1969, 3 days after the Rouse confrontation, the first body was discovered. Vinny Russo, a Bonanno family associate who ran heroin distribution in East Harlem, was found in an alley behind his social club, shot twice in the head execution style, killed with professional precision that suggested Lucas's people had tracked Russo's movements, had identified when he was vulnerable, had executed him without witnesses or evidence that could lead to arrests. A note was pinned to Russo's body. 1 down, 6 to go. Carmine Galante disrespected Frank Lucas at Rouse. This is the cost. Tuesday brought another death. Anthony Tony Benedetto, who collected heroin proceeds from dealers throughout Harlem, was found in his car in the Bronx, shot multiple times, killed in what appeared to be an ambush that had been carefully planned, that demonstrated Lucas's organization had intelligence about Bonanno operations that shouldn't have been available to outsiders. Wednesday, Michael Mikey Costello, dead. Thursday, James Jimmy Romano, dead. Friday, Peter Pete Lombardi, dead. Saturday, Thomas Tommy D'Angelo, dead. Sunday, Robert Bobby Marchese, dead. 7 Bonanno family associates dead in 7 days. All of them involved in heroin distribution in Harlem. All of them killed with professional precision. All of them found with notes that explicitly connected their deaths to Carmine Galante's public humiliation of Frank Lucas, that made it clear these weren't random killings or territorial disputes, but were systematic retaliation for specific disrespect shown at Rouse Restaurant. The response shocked New York's organized crime community. The Italian mob had faced challenges before, had dealt with competitors and with territorial disputes, but they'd never experienced this kind of systematic targeting, this kind of professional, military-style elimination of key personnel, this kind of message that made it clear that disrespecting Frank Lucas carried costs that exceeded anything the Italian families were willing to pay. Carmine Galante tried to respond. He ordered hits on Lucas's known associates, sent people to attack Lucas's distribution networks, attempted to use mob influence with police to get Lucas arrested. But Lucas had disappeared, had gone into hiding immediately after leaving Rouse, had continued running his operations through intermediaries while remaining personally unreachable. While Galante's organization struggled to find targets for retaliation, because Lucas had compartmentalized his operations so effectively that even killing his known associates didn't disrupt his ability to continue importing and distributing heroin. By Sunday, November 23, 1969, 10 days after the Rouse confrontation, the Bonanno family's heroin operations in Harlem had effectively collapsed. 7 key people were dead. Other associates had gone into hiding or had quit rather than risk being next on Lucas's list. Distribution networks that had taken years to build had been destroyed in 10 days because Frank Lucas had demonstrated that he could systematically eliminate anyone involved in mob operations in Harlem without being caught or stopped. Carmine Galante, facing pressure from other mob families who were watching this situation carefully, facing questions from his superiors about why he'd provoked Lucas in ways that had led to massive losses, facing the reality that continuing this conflict would result in more deaths and more disruption, made a decision that was humiliating but necessary. He ordered the complete withdrawal of Bonanno family heroin operations from Harlem, abandoned territory they'd controlled for decades, accepted that Frank Lucas had won this confrontation through superior violence and superior organizational capability. A message was sent to Lucas through intermediaries. The Bonanno family was withdrawing from Harlem. No tribute would be demanded. No further attacks would be made on Lucas's operations. The mob acknowledged that Lucas's independence would be respected and that Italian families would not attempt to force him to pay for the right to operate in New York. Lucas emerged from hiding, resumed his normal operations, and made it clear to everyone in New York's underworld that the 7 deaths in 7 days had been a message. Disrespecting Frank Lucas in public, using racial slurs, demanding tribute from someone who'd built his operation independently. All of that carried consequences that even powerful Italian mob families couldn't afford to pay. For Carmine Galante personally, the incident was devastating. He'd lost 7 associates, had been forced to abandon territory, had been humiliated in front of other mob families who viewed the Bonanno withdrawal from Harlem as evidence that Galante wasn't capable of handling challenges from independent black criminals. Galante's reputation never fully recovered. His ambitions to take over the Bonanno family and to become one of New York's most powerful mob bosses were undermined by the perception that he'd started a war with Frank Lucas and had lost decisively. The broader significance of the November 1969 confrontation was that it demonstrated the limits of traditional mob power when confronting independent criminals who'd built operations outside the usual structures. The Italian mob had controlled heroin distribution in New York for decades through connections, through political influence, through violence that was supposed to deter challenges. But Lucas had proven that intelligence and strategic thinking and willingness to use systematic violence could overcome traditional advantages. That being outside the mob structure was actually an advantage, because it meant Lucas could act without the bureaucratic constraints and the political considerations that limited what Italian families could do. Thursday evening, November 13th, 1969, at Rao's restaurant on East 114th Street. The night Carmine Galante made the catastrophic decision to publicly humiliate Frank Lucas, to use racial slurs, to demand tribute, to threaten Lucas's operations in front of dozens of witnesses. The confrontation that lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but that triggered 7 days of systematic killings, that destroyed Bonanno family heroin operations in Harlem, and that forced the Italian mob to acknowledge that Frank Lucas's independence would be respected because the alternative, continuing the war, would cost more than any mob family was willing to pay. The insult that cost an empire, the racial slurs that triggered systematic retaliation, the demand for tribute that resulted in 7 deaths and complete withdrawal from territory the mob had controlled for decades. November 1969, when Carmine Galante learned too late that Frank Lucas wasn't someone who could be publicly humiliated without consequences, that black criminals who'd built independent operations were just as capable of violence and just as willing to use it as any Italian mob family. That disrespect carried costs that exceeded any benefits that might come from asserting traditional mob dominance. The night at Rao's when pride met ruthlessness and lost everything in 7 days of systematic violence that changed power dynamics in New York's drug trade forever.